Since the formation of the United Federation of Planets, the interstellar political situation of what is known as the Alpha and Beta quadrants of the galaxy have been dominated by essentially the same powers. In addition to the Federation, the Klingon Empire, Romulan Star Empire, Cardassian Union, and the Ferengi Alliance constitute the major nations of this specific corner of the galaxy. Others certainly exist and have at times influenced galactic affairs, but few can match these five in their sustained level of involvement and influence. But how might these powers fit into a formal hierarchy? What might be the Templin Institute's appraisal of their standings in relation to one another? Or more simply, how would we rank the galactic powers of this galaxy? Now, of course, the balance of power has shifted over time, so we'll focus on the era in which we have the most information, specifically the year 2370. That's 3 years prior to the outbreak of the Dominion War, right before the geopolitical order of the galaxy radically changed. And though information is still sparse, we'll also speculate on the standings of these nations in the year 2400, 25 years after the war and 13 years after the destruction of Romulus. And just to provide a bit of added perspective, we'll also be including the Borg Collective, the Dominion, and the Breen Confederacy. Now, I understand it's common when subjectively ranking various elements by their respective viability or capabilities to use letter gradings. Typically, the S tier is particularly powerful, the A tier less so, through B, C, D, etc. This might be good enough for others, but the Templin Institute has a reputation to consider, and our methodology must be more precise. Instead, we'll be classifying our galactic nations as either hyperpowers, superpowers, great powers, regional powers, middle powers, or small powers. Given we're only dealing with the predominant nations of the galaxy, I wouldn't expect to see any in those latter classifications. But how are we defining each of these categories? Well, any nation-state might be judged on their ability to project power, whether through economic, military, technological, political, or cultural means, together with diplomacy and other expressions of soft power. A hyperpower would be a nation that dominates every other in every domain we just discussed. It has no rivals that can even hope to match its capabilities. A superpower is a state that has achieved a dominant position in many of these dimensions, but not necessarily all of them. More importantly though, it is not without rivals, which might potentially be other superpowers or smaller powers that can reasonably counter them in specific regions. Great powers have substantial capabilities in most expressions of state power, but are not necessarily dominant in any of them. Regional powers, as the name implies, might dominate in any or all of these areas, but only within a smaller geographic region. A middle power has a large or moderate influence, but that might be limited to a select few domains, militarily or economically, for example. And finally, a small state possesses no great capability in any area and must rely on other states for either political, economic, or societal shelter. Okay, so let's start with the United Federation of Planets, which, given the immense amount of information we have concerning its capabilities, will make a great baseline for the remainder of our nations. I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that the Federation scores high in every possible category. It has a strong and stable democratic government, which aside from the occasional alien infiltration, has operated without any major internal incidents in all its recorded history. This is all the more impressive when you consider the Federation incorporates hundreds of alien civilizations, each with their own colonies and interests. It has abandoned currency-based economics in favor of some philosophy of self-enhancement, and while I don't know what that means exactly, it's clear that internally the Federation has utopian levels of consumer goods, while exporting tremendous amounts of those same goods to foreign markets. I think a lot of people would argue that the Federation lacks any real military power, with Starfleet being a primarily scientific and exploratory body, but I disagree. Whatever its intended role, Starfleet is capable of projecting power just as well as a dedicated navy. Most importantly, it has proven able to hold its own against the Klingons, Cardassians, and the Dominion, nations dedicated almost exclusively to military power. That the Federation can do this without purpose-built warships and an all-volunteer force is extraordinary. I really think the Federation is a sleeping giant. That would explain why, during the Dominion War, the Jem'Hadar and their allies focused on destroying Federation shipyards and industry, because unless the Federation was defeated in the first 2 to 3 years, it would be slowly able to transition to a wartime footing and bring its overwhelming resources to bear. The Federation's greatest advantage, though, is that it's not an ethnic state based around a single species, but rather an ideological state. This in itself gives the Federation an enormous advantage over pretty much every other nation we'll be discussing. How many alien civilizations across the galaxy have a vested interest in seeing Klingon or Romulan nationalism prevail? Probably just the Klingons and Romulans. But liberty, justice, equality, the things the Federation is based on, are near universal values, and it creates instant allies and partners pretty much everywhere.
What do you think? It's vile. I know. It's so bubbly and cloying and happy. But you know what's really frightening? If you drink enough of it, you begin to like it.
Okay, so with all that said, where does the Federation end up on our list? Well, I think certain Federation members alone, like the Vulcans, Andorians, and Earth, might count as regional or even great powers. So together, I'm ranking the Federation as the foremost superpower of the Alpha and Beta quadrants. Moving on to the Klingon Empire. I get the sense that for most analysts, the Klingons take the second place behind the Federation. But to me, they're a bit of a paper tiger. For all their history, the Klingons have emphasized their martial warrior culture, but their disproportionate focus on the military has weakened every other sector of their civilization, which then comes back around to weaken their military as well. Nothing without a direct effect on the military is given any kind of development, so their technology, economy, and diplomatic efforts all underperform.
As you can see from the gross adjusted assets tabulation in column J, the net value of the land acquisition was actually 0. Now, if you go to the file marked devaluation of capital income, we can review the way before.
Even Klingon medical studies, something that should be a priority for the armed forces, is largely superficial, meaning injuries and trauma that other species might recover from will kill Klingons. Politically, things are not much better. Machinations between the great houses have resulted in systemic corruption and civil wars. It is a two-dimensional civilization. But I think Ezri Dax put it best.
The Klingon Empire is dying, and I think it deserves to die. I see a society that is in deep denial about itself. We're talking about a warrior culture that prides itself on maintaining centuries-old traditions of honor and integrity, but in reality, it's willing to accept corruption at the highest level.
Because of these deficiencies and others, I'm going to classify the Klingon Empire as a great power. But I think even this might be charitable. The Klingon military is the only aspect in which they excel, but even their military capabilities are stifled by their weaknesses elsewhere. Now we get to the Romulan Star Empire, and full disclosure, I really like the Romulans. I will try and be objective, but if you want to criticize my biases, this is the section to do it. In my opinion, the Romulan Empire is the true rival to the Federation. While small political movements exist that oppose the central government, Romulan authority has been stable and powerful for all its recorded history. Romulans are overwhelmingly dedicated to the state, with the phrase Romulan defector said to be an almost contradiction in terms by one Starfleet captain. Its economy seems pretty much self-sufficient, with the entire state able to maintain an isolationist stance for decades and emerge from it stronger. Technologically, the Romulan Star Empire is maybe the only major Alpha or Beta quadrant power ahead of the Federation in more fields of study than it is behind. Part of this is that the Romulans are able to develop technology that the Federation is unwilling to. Their greatest example of this is, of course, their cloaking technology, which gives their military an enormous edge. It's very telling that during the Dominion War, Romulan fleets were assigned predominantly Jem'Hadar targets, which represented the strongest forces facing Allied fleets. Romulan weaknesses are generally confined to their foreign policy. Romulan isolationism has left them with basically no meaningful allies, and they usually have to work with paid, unreliable intermediaries. The Romulan predisposition towards deceit and betrayal has also tarnished their reputation with every major galactic power, and can be credited with forming the Klingon Federation Alliance. Romulan miscalculations in their foreign policy like this have resulted in some of the biggest geopolitical blunders in history. With that in mind, I'm classifying the Romulan Star Empire as a superpower. That's probably my bias coming out, though. Compared to the Federation, they are certainly still a distant second place. Now, before I move on, I want to make a brief detour into the realm of interstellar cartography. There are a few maps out there that supposedly detail the territorial extent of these powers and others. In most cases, the Klingon Empire is portrayed as roughly the same size as the Federation, and the Romulans are almost entirely encircled and much smaller. Based on these maps, my classifications might seem incongruous, but these maps also contradict a few written statements, making their accuracy very nebulous, so they're not going to factor into my calculations here. Okay, but moving on, we arrive at the Cardassian Union, and I think it's fair to say that this is the sick man of the Alpha Quadrant. In every major area, the Cardassians are well behind the Federation. Like the Klingon Empire, they have dedicated the resources of the state towards the military, but in practical terms, this has been mostly to keep their own population in line rather than to attempt external conquests. Their largest military operation up to this point was the occupation of Bajor, which they were unable to sustain. Cardassian weaknesses are unfortunately all derived from their interstellar geography. The few worlds and star systems they control are poor, and Cardassia just can't maintain the same capabilities as the other major powers of the Alpha Quadrant. Even when fighting against a poorly equipped insurgency, the Cardassians suffered major losses. Their only real area of proficiency is their intelligence services, but a large percentage of its resources are wasted on domestic espionage against their own population. The Cardassian Union is a regional power at best. The Ferengi Alliance is a bit more difficult to gauge. I think they share the primary aspect of the Klingon Empire in that they have dedicated themselves to just one aspect of their civilization, in this case their economy, to the detriment of all others. The Alliance is probably the single greatest financial center in the galaxy, but it's hard to gauge the benefits of this. The Federation has moved beyond traditional economics, the Klingons and Romulans aren't really involved in intergalactic markets, so the Ferengi are doing most of their business with other smaller powers. The Ferengi have achieved dominance in this field, not through their own business acumen, but because every other major power has little interest in competing with them. Additionally, the Ferengi tend to prioritize short-term gains over long-term stable profits. Their reputation as greedy swindlers means they constantly need to find new markets as their old ones eventually refuse to do business with them. The Ferengi Alliance seems like a house of cards, riddled with fraud and destined to eventually collapse. I rank them as a middle power. Now, the Breen Confederacy is infamous for the complete lack of information available on their civilization, so we must travel deeper into the zone of speculation. We can really only gauge them on their performance during the Dominion War, the only time they were heavily involved with the greater galaxy. The Dominion certainly considered the Breen a valuable ally, and their initial involvement in the war was disastrous for the Allies, even going so far as to directly attack Earth. But as soon as countermeasures for their weapons were developed, the threat of the Breen dissipated very quickly. The Confederacy seems like a one-trick pony, and their isolationist, reclusive nature limits their ability to project power, even if their capabilities are more advanced than I give them credit for. I'm classifying them as a middle power. Now we venture outside the Alpha and Beta quadrants to the Dominion. In every expression of state power, the Dominion's capabilities are extraordinary. Its economy, technology, and military are overwhelming compared to the other nations we have described so far. It's also a mono-ethnic state that masquerades as an ideological one, promising stability and prosperity to any who revere the founders as gods. This might not be as tempting to most civilizations as Federation membership would be if they had the choice, but it's not exactly a terrible deal either. The founders have a vested interest in keeping their client species happy, or at least subservient. Dominion diplomacy is therefore very good, and for every member species conquered by force, there is another that joined willingly. The ability of the Founders to infiltrate other governments is unrivaled and gives the Dominion a further edge. The Dominion's weakness, however, is likely their lack of flexibility. At the start of the Dominion War, they had a sizable technological advantage over the Federation and its allies. By the end of the conflict, though, that gap had shrunk significantly. Their opponents, mainly the Federation, were able to adapt in a way the Dominion itself could not. Additionally, and this cannot be overstated, the power of the Dominion endures only so long as they can produce Ketracel White. Without it, the Jem'Hadar, and therefore the entire Dominion military, would collapse. Despite this, I am classifying the Dominion as a hyperpower. In the Gamma Quadrant, they seem completely unrivaled. Now, the Borg are going to be difficult, as they do not fit well into this method of classification. Superpower, regional power, even the concept of power itself is completely antithetical to the Borg collective. They have no government, no economy, no culture, and the most rudimentary diplomatic system. Even their military doesn't fit the traditional definitions of one. Borg cubes do not project power, they only assimilate. So if we were to rigidly adhere to conventional definitions of power, the Borg wouldn't really even qualify. They'd be a middle power or even a small power. But that hardly reflects the vast capabilities of the collective. This is a civilization of trillions of drones all working together in perfect alignment. They are technologically superior to most every other species and have assimilated many thousands of civilizations. They may not be one in the traditional sense, but the Borg are a hyperpower, surpassing even that of the Dominion. So that's how we'd classify the major powers of the galaxy in 2370. How does the situation change over the next 30 years? Well, we can start with what a member of Starfleet Intelligence had to say.
Because when the war is over, the following will happen in short order. The Dominion will be forced back to the Gamma Quadrant. The Cardassian Empire will be occupied. The Klingon Empire will spend the next 10 years recovering from the war and won't pose a serious threat to anyone. That leaves two powers to vie for control of the quadrant.
Obviously, whoever this man was, I can't seem to find any record of him, couldn't have predicted a few major events, but his assessment gives us a good starting point. The Federation likely emerged from the Dominion War bloodied but hardly crippled. As the primary victor, it was in a very strong position to dictate the terms of the surrender, but likely didn't impose anything too harsh on the defeated powers. The attack on Mars was a devastating blow to the Federation, but not exactly anything worse that had occurred during the Dominion War. The Federation's status seems to have been largely consistent, but the same thing cannot be said for its neighbors. I think in the year 2400, the Federation is now a hyperpower simply by the virtue that its only rival superpower, the Romulans, suffered their own cataclysm that significantly impacted their capabilities. The Klingons, meanwhile, could be in two very different places. If it is adhered to the old ways, then the decline of the Klingon Empire is likely ongoing, and they may have not even yet recovered from the Dominion War. In order to survive, I think the Klingon Empire needs to undergo a difficult cultural transformation. There was a moment when Worf, son of Moog, convinced a group of Klingons to aid farmers in the planting of their crops, and this is how he did it.
You said there was an enemy for us to fight.
They are attempting to plant their fields before the sun sets. Time is their enemy. We should help them defeat it.
Bring the others.
To me, this is how the Klingon Empire survives, by changing the definition of what it means to be a warrior. If the Klingon people can be convinced that time, famine, poverty, and whatever else is afflicting their civilization is an enemy that must be fought, and that fight is every bit as honorable as open warfare, then the road to a real recovery can begin. But even if that transformation has started, 30 years likely isn't enough time for it to have been completed. Regardless of which direction they went, I think the Klingon Empire in 2400 are now a regional power. So what about the Romulans? Obviously, the destruction of their homeworld in 2387 was a massive calamity, probably the largest in history. So their current state all comes down to what percentage of Romulan capabilities were based on the planet. Personally, and this may be my bias coming through again, I always believed that Romulus was a political center, not necessarily an economic or industrial one. Remus, likewise, seemed more of a mining colony than a core world in the Romulan Empire. I think the loss of these planets would be akin to the destruction of Washington, D.C. or Beijing on our own world. Politically, this would be devastating, but the majority of their respective nations' economic, industrial, and military capabilities would remain intact. We have seen that the Romulan Free State, the supposed successor to the Empire, does maintain a large fleet of warships and was seemingly willing to confront Starfleet, so I'm inclined to believe that Romulan capabilities are still substantial. I'll classify them in 2400 as a regional power. The Cardassians too suffered tremendous losses, though during the Dominion War, but were in a much better position to recover from them. The Cardassian Union might no longer exist, but whatever government replaced it is almost certainly friendly towards the Federation. The Cardassians were probably the recipients of enormous economic recovery programs and could potentially even be in the process of applying for Federation membership. If they are still independent though, I believe they're a regional power, but no longer declining as they were in 2370. The Ferengi Alliance probably benefited enormously from the Dominion War. War is good for business after all. I have to imagine they were only too eager to help fund the reconstruction efforts across the Alpha Quadrant. It's also feasible that reforms implemented by Grant Nagus Rom have removed many of the most negative aspects of Ferengi society. In 2400, I'll classify the Ferengi Alliance as a great power. But what can we say about the Breen? They're as mysterious as ever, but having retreated back into the shadows and no longer active on the galactic stage, I think they're still just a middle power. The Dominion is another difficult one, and like the Klingons, could go one of two ways. If they reformed their civilization following the loss of the Dominion War, then it's probable that all their client species would have been granted either total independence or remained part of a looser confederation. If the founders did not fundamentally reform the Dominion, then by 2400 they would have fully recovered from the Dominion War. I am split on this one, but willing to accept that some sort of reform must have taken place. I think the Dominion is now a superpower. The final mystery is that of the Borg. One of the last times we saw the collective, it had been infected by our neurolytic pathogen and was in the process of being destroyed. I have to imagine the Borg eventually developed some sort of cure for this, but not before suffering enormous damage. I think the collective is crippled, with their recent plea for help from Admiral Jean-Luc Picard only further evidence of this. In the year 2400, I believe they most resemble a regional power. But that, of course, is just my opinion. And even though a member of the Q Continuum appeared before me and exclaimed that I had gotten everything exactly right, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with my placements? How would you have ranked the major powers of the galaxy? And is there another galaxy you'd like to see the Templin Institute speculate on? Let us know in the comments below, and until next time, this has been Incoming. In Incoming, the Templin Institute discusses the theories and ideas found across alternate worlds. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to join the Templin Institute, consider pledging to our Patreon page. Along with increased security access, you'll be able to vote in polls to determine future topics, get custom wallpaper every week, and receive some other exclusive rewards.